You'll notice that one really common way by which the Lord teaches people about spiritual truths is to use a vehicle called parables, right? And so a parable is basically a way of teaching people about, again, spiritual truths, things about the reality of God, using everyday, ordinary examples and imagery. And so it kind of begs the question, why does the Lord typically use parables to teach the people of God as opposed to speaking them in a more straightforward sort of way? And so, one really important reason why the Lord typically uses parables is because of the nature of the subject matter. And so, to kind of frame the issue, perhaps I might draw upon an example from Bishop Robert Barron. And so, Bishop Barron uses the analogy of boy meets girl. And specifically, what he says is that imagine there's a boy who's interested in a girl. And so, it kind of begs the question, how might he begin to get to know that girl? Perhaps he might begin by looking her up on the internet and finding interesting facts and information about her through that particular vehicle. And perhaps later on, he might speak to people who know her, speak to her neighbors, speak to her friends, garnering more information through that particular means. And on top of that, perhaps he might simply watch her. Kind of creepy, but true, right? So watching her from a distance, trying to figure out certain things about who she is, what she likes, that kind of thing. But then Bishop Barron says that obviously, eventually it'll get to the point where if the boy really wants to get to know the girl, eventually he'll have to pick up the courage to actually talk to her. And if she agrees to talk to him, certainly she will say certain things about herself that he already knew through reason and observation. But then eventually, if the conversation continues and she continues to reveal things about herself, eventually she will say things about herself that he cannot verify through reason and observation, but which he can still receive to be true based on the willingness to trust in what she says. And that third category of knowing a person beyond reason and observation is what we might call revelation. And so again, just to go back to our original point, one of the main reasons why the Lord typically uses parables to speak to the people of God is because he's speaking about revelation. And what's revelation but God's free choice to self-disclose about the secrets of his inner life and the path to enter into a more deep, intimate relationship with him. And so again, given the nature of the subject matter, it wouldn't be appropriate to kind of convey the secrets of God's inner life using a more reductive vehicle. And so, for example, it's not the same thing as conveying the solution to a math problem. Nor would it be appropriate to use something like a fable, right, where you simply say, well, the moral of the story is this versus that. It's more appropriate, in contrast, to use imagery and language and poetry, which simply invites people to go deeper and deeper and deeper. Again, as opposed to inviting them to simply look for a simple, straightforward answer, because that's the nature of God's inner life. It's this limitless mystery by which he constantly draws us into a deeper relationship with him. Now, that said, another really important reason why the Lord uses parables is actually articulated in the gospel itself. Specifically in the gospel of Matthew chapter 13, where the disciples themselves ask Jesus precisely this question: why do you speak to the people in parables? And in response, Jesus basically says to them, the people of God have this tendency to see without seeing and to hear without hearing. In other words, the people of God have this recurring tendency to block the reception of truth, life-giving truth, because of a certain hardness of heart. And so the whole idea is that because of this recurring hardness of hearts, perhaps a more effective strategy to bring people to the light, to bring people to the truth, is to do what Bishop Barron calls leading with the beautiful. And so basically Bishop Barron, quoting Aristotle, I think, he talks about the good, the true, and the beautiful. And specifically what he says, for example, is that if you lead with the true, telling people what to think, this is true as opposed to that which is false, people tend to get their backs up. Likewise, he says that when you lead with the good, telling people this is what you should do because it's, again, right or true, people tend to get their backs up. And so given all that, perhaps a more effective way to evangelize is to lead with the beautiful, to simply show someone a beautiful thing, based on the principle that if a person kind of follows beauty to its logical end, eventually it will lead to a discovery of the true and the good. Because these three things, the good, the true, and the beautiful, are mutually implicative, right? And so each one of these things, regardless of what you start with, will eventually lead to a discovery of the other two things. In any case, because the Lord talks about the hardness of heart of the people of God as a specific reason as to why he speaks in parables, it's no coincidence that this particular answer in response to the question, why do you speak in parables, is preceded by this really famous parable, the parable of the sower. Because, of course, one of the main points with regards to the parable of the sower is to articulate and highlight key reasons why people have made themselves impervious to the reception of God's grace and its transformative truth, as articulated by these images of the path, the thorns, and the rocky ground. And so, as you might recall, with regards to this particular parable, the Lord gives this image of this sower who's very generously kind of sowing seed everywhere, right? But when it falls on the path and the thorns and the rocky ground, it doesn't bear fruit. So again, these three images are meant to kind of convey different ways in which people tend to be hard when it comes to the reception of God's grace and His truth. And so with regards to this image of the path, basically this represents people who have made their hearts kind of impervious to receiving God's grace because they've allowed their hearts to be basically trampled upon by the world in this really indiscriminate sort of way. And so the example that comes to mind, whenever I'm visiting schools, and specifically when I'm speaking to older kids, I often forget that one particular reason why they might be kind of impervious to receiving the things that I'm saying to them is because of things that go beyond the immediate communication, right? And so oftentimes I'll forget this and I'll think, well, maybe I just need to pitch it a certain way or whatever. And I forget that actually a lot of times their hearts and minds have been unduly compromised by such things as social media, video games, pornography, even something as simple as binge watching on TV. All these things kind of put together have this cumulative undue effect of limiting one's ability to receive spiritual truths. And so again, this is a really important example to illustrate this notion of the path. Now, with regards to the image of the rocky ground, basically this kind of represents someone who, again, is impervious to God's grace and His truth because they're basically superficial when it comes to their approach to life. And so I often think about this particular image when it comes to adults, right? And so oftentimes adults are kind of impervious when it comes to God's grace and His truth because they have a closed understanding of life. And so perhaps the idea is that I've lived life for a long time, perhaps I've traveled, perhaps I'm simply old. And because of that, I have a complete understanding of life. And so therefore, I'm impervious to learning more or receiving something which is new. Whereas in reality, what I'm actually doing perhaps is living a simply superficial life, where I'm simply living on the surface as opposed to being open to that which is new and potentially completely transformative. In any case, the third image when it comes to the parable of the sower is that of the thorns, right? And the thorns, basically they represent someone who is caught up with the cares of the world and a desire for wealth. Now, in the original translation, it's not so much wealth, it's more like mammon, right? And mammon basically is anything less than God, as opposed to strictly money or cash. And so basically the whole idea here is that we can often get fixated. We can often get fixated on certain things that we kind of draw our attention to, such that we become blind to other things. And so the example that comes to mind, I remember once giving a homily in a parish setting where a young man came up to me and was really critical about one aspect of the homily that appeared early on. And initially I was just trying to engage with him in a logical, straightforward sort of manner when all of a sudden it occurred to me that the reason why that point didn't make sense to him was because he stopped listening. And so he listened to this point early on in the homily that I further expound upon later on, but he kind of stopped listening. He listened to step 1 without accounting for step 2, 3, and 4, as a result of which the entire homily didn't make sense, not because it wasn't explained well, but because he simply stopped listening after the first couple minutes or so. And again, that's just a really easy way to explain this image of the thorns in the context of the parable of the sower. Okay, one final example, I'll kind of end with this. So recently I was listening to an episode from this podcast called the Rewatchables, which is so named because the people hosting the podcast, they basically review movies both old and new, which they deem to be rewatchable. And so the context of this particular episode I was listening to, basically the focal point of the episode was this movie called Big, which came out in 1988 starring Tom Hanks. And so as sort of a quick recap, the movie basically revolves around this 12-year-old boy who makes a wish and then subsequently becomes this adult, played by Tom Hanks. But anyways, in the context of this particular episode, the question was raised amongst the group as to what was their favorite scene within the context of the film. In response to which most of the people cited this really famous scene from the movie where basically the Tom Hanks character is with his future boss and they're in this toy store and they're basically playing on this toy piano, which you can kind of play by dancing on the keys. But you see, what's interesting is that the people who cited this particular scene as being their favorite also cited sort of mixed feelings. So on the one hand, they took great delight in the scene because, quite frankly, it's just really well done. But at the same time, they kind of expressed a certain sadness. And so in the words of one of the co-hosts, basically he was kind of lamenting a lost sense of childhood. And in particular, he mourned the sense that he had lost the capacity for wonder, as well as the capacity to stay fully present in a particular moment. You see, that said, in light of everything we've been talking about today, the thing I want to suggest to you is that all is not lost, right? And so even though it is arguably, in a certain sense, more difficult to recover and subsequently live out of a spiritual sense of childhood, the deeper you kind of plunge yourself into the adult thing, at the same time, it remains possible. And so the whole idea is that if you make up your mind to be mindful of the parable of the sower as you live out your life, and in particular those 3 temptations as embodied by, again, the path, the rocky ground, and the thorns, perhaps you might come to realize God's will for your life, to see with your eyes, to listen with your ears, to understand with your heart, such that eventually you might come to turn back to the Lord and be healed, and thereby come to realize all of God's deep desires for your life, for peace, for joy, for freedom, for happiness, all the fruits of a deep reconciliation with your Father in heaven. And may God bless you all.